Hello everyone and welcome to MTX Chess. Thanks for watching this video. You may have noticed that we spruced up the video presentation a little bit. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you like it. Today we're talking about the best scoring opening for White, the Queen's Gambit. When I say best scoring, I really mean it. If you look at Master Games, White scores 58 points out of 100 games playing the Queen's Gambit. What we're going to do today is talk about why you should consider playing the Queen's Gambit. We will touch on a couple of the main ideas in the Queen's Gambit, hit on the most important lines. I'm excited to show you a couple of exciting traps, and we will end the video with me sharing the line that I most often like to play. So the Queen's Gambit starts with d4, d5, c4. So why should you play this opening? If you're new to chess, you've probably been playing a lot of e4, and e4 can lead to exciting tactical games with plenty of opportunities to come out in the opening with a clear advantage. But the problem I see with a lot of young players is that they forget that after the opening comes the middle game. Players stuck in the 12 to 1400 level have probably developed enough chess understanding to come out even in openings, even against superior opponents. But they get thrashed in the middle game because they never develop the positional understanding that they need, and they have a hard time developing long-term strategies. The Queen's Gambit is a great opening to play because many of the lines are relatively straightforward with an emphasis on efficient development and with clear middle game strategy. If you're an e4 player and you feel that your chess progress is stalled, it may be time to start playing d4 to improve your positional understanding. So that said, let's talk about what White accomplishes with this second move. With c4, White offers Black his c-pawn in exchange for control of the center. This is the Gambit part of the Queen's Gambit. It's called the Queen's Gambit because the pawn on the Queen side of the board is on the Queen side of the board as opposed to the King side of the board. This is directly opposite the King's Gambit. The King's Gambit starts with e4, e5, f4. Here we reach a similar position as the Queen's Gambit, with the key difference between being that we're playing now on the King side of the board. If we go back to this position, Black has a couple options that outline the lines we'll cover for the rest of this video. The first line is the Queen's Gambit accepted, where Black plays d takes c4. The second line is the Queen's Gambit decline, where Black plays e6 to support the d5 pawn. The third line is the Slob Defense, where Black plays c6 to support the d5 pawn. And the fourth line we'll cover today is the Alapin counter Gambit, where Black does something completely different, and they play e5, which is a sharp counter Gambit that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. Okay, so let's start with d takes c4. The Queen's Gambit accepted. Accepting the Gambit is not automatically bad for Black, and Grandmasters will accept the Gambit with some regularity, believe it or not. Even though White is giving up a pawn, they will win it back quickly. After e3, the bishop is ready to capture the pawn on c4. If Black makes the mistake of trying to defend the pawn, he can fall into one of the most famous traps in chess. If Black were trying to defend the pawn, a typical defensive move would be something like b5. White can respond to this with a4. In this position, a6 won't work for Black because after takes, the Black rook hangs. So we know a6 won't work. So another thing Black could try and do is defend this b5 pawn with c6. What happens here is White does the same thing. A takes b, c takes b, and now White has a White to move and win in this position. Go ahead and pause the video and try and find the move for White. So White wins with queen f3. So what this does is basically the rook hangs. Black is going to have a really difficult time defending this rook, and if they try and give you the bishop instead, you'll just take, and even if they do hold on to the rook, you're going to be up so much material as White. It's clearly winning for White. So if you go back, instead of trying to hold on to this pawn, after e3, a better move for Black would be knight f6. After bishop takes c4, Black and White exchange a pair of normal developmental moves like e6 and knight f3. In this position, if both sides continue to play normal developmental moves like bishop e7, castle kingside, knight c3, knight c6, we've reached an opening where White has tremendous control of the center with opportunities to expand their real estate with ideas like e4, e5. A good opponent will understand this and try to disrupt White's center early on. If we go back to this position, Black might challenge White's center with the move c5, threatening to exchange pawns on d4 and create an isolated queen's pawn, which will be a great target for black's army in the middle of the game. Here, white can castle. At this point, a lot of grandmasters playing black will try and establish an initiative on the queen side with a move like a6, preparing b5 with a tempo on the bishop. White can respond to this in two ways. He can respond by either playing a4 and exerting some control over that b4 square, or white can play my personal favorite, bishop b3. Now, if black plays b5, white can play a4, and black's basically forced to play b4, weakening this c4 square. Let's go back. Or if black plays here, knight c6, you can simply play queen e2 with plans of moving the rook to d1 if there's exchange on the d4 square. So for instance, instead of taking back with this pawn, right, because this pawn's defended twice and you only have two attackers, here you would move the rook to d1, and now this pawn will be pinned to the queen. In these lines, once the center opens up, white can drop the b3 bishop back to c2, eyeing the h7 square, with ideas of the eventual queen h5 once the center clears out and the black king castles. The classic example game for this line was played in 2001 between Kramnik and Vishy Anand. If you're interested in seeing this bishop coming alive for a masterful h7 attack, then check out that game in the description below. Cutting back to our original position, after d4, d5, c4, what if black decides to play the queen's gambit decline with e6? White's next best move is knight c3. Here, black's most common move is knight f6. Then white plays bishop f4, or we could conversely do bishop g5. I prefer bishop g5. After bishop g7, e3. It's very important for white to get their dark squared bishop outside their pawn chain. You can see that their pawn chain's here. The problem with the queen's gambit decline for black is that their light squared bishop is stuck for a large portion of the opening and early middle game. White ensures that they won't have any problem by getting their dark squared bishop outside their pawn chain. If you're playing white in the queen's gambit, you also have to be comfortable with exchanging your dark squared bishop if your opponent's knight if the position calls for it. You'll give your opponent the bishop pair, but the reality is that the knight is far more active than the light colored bishop is going to be for some time. So after black castles, knight f3, h6, white should be comfortable exchanging here on f6. Here white has the options of capturing on c5, playing bishop d3, getting their rook involved, moving their queen to c2 or to d2 with eventual castling. So that's really the main line of the queen's gambit decline. Let me show you real quick the elephant trap, which happens after, if we go back, so d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c6, bishop, knight f6, bishop g5, knight bd7. So up until this knight bd7 move, this is what we had in our previous example with the bishop coming to g5. Black makes this sneaky move, and this is the starting point for what is known as the elephant trap. White falls for the trap when they get greedy, trying to win a pawn in the opening. You may notice that this pawn right here is attacked twice, but really only defended once because this knight is pinned to the queen. So if white gets greedy, they could try and exchange on this square, and thinking that this knight is really pinned to this queen, they'll also capture this pawn. So what's just happened is white has given up one pawn and gained two of black's. White is upper pawn. But after knight takes d5 here, black recaptures with knight takes d5 of their own. They sacrifice their queen. After bishop takes d8, black has bishop b4 check. White has no choice but to block with the queen. So after queen d2, bishop takes 2, king takes d2, king takes d8. White finds themselves losing down a piece, down the knight, pretty early in the opening. So don't fall for this elephant trap. But just when you thought we were done, there's actually more in the same position in terms of traps. If we go back, so this is the position we were just in, where white, if they take this pawn and try and win a pawn here, they can fall for the elephant trap. But black has another famous trap that white can fall into just a few moves later. Instead of c takes d5, which would be starting the elephant trap, If white continues with the natural looking e3, black can play c6. And after knight f3, black sets up what is called the Cambridge Springs defense with queen a5. Here the best move for white would probably be to exchange the bishop for the knight on f6. But if white makes the mistake of playing the normal looking bishop d3, black can punish it with d takes c4. Obviously there's an attack now on the bishop, but also a discovered attack on the g5 bishop from the queen. Or after bishop takes c4, black has the great knight e4. What this move does is fork both the bishop on g5 and put pressure on this pinned knight on c3. If white tries to defend the knight, you win the bishop. For instance, queen c2, knight takes bishop, knight takes bishop, knight takes bishop, queen takes bishop, or queen takes knight, right? So now black has just won a piece. If you go back, and if white moves the bishop, if white chooses to move the bishop out of harm's way with a move like this, you have knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3 check. White cannot block with the queen because you lose the rook. So after knight d2 to block check, we've got bishop b4. An unpleasant position for white. This could proceed a couple different ways, but after rook c1, queen takes d2, queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, king takes d2, black's going to castle, and they're up a pawn in the endgame. So this, and white also has this kind of awkward dark square bishop. So if you're playing the Queen's Gambit decline as white, be aware of the Cambridge Springs, and don't fall for this trap because it's an unpleasant endgame to play as white down a pawn. All right, coming back to our original position, let's talk about our next variation. So d4, d5, c4, we've already covered the accepted variations. If we go back, we just covered kind of the main line of the declined. Now let's talk about the Slob defense, which is when black plays c6. Here black chooses to play c6 instead of e6 in the decline variation because they want to activate their light square bishop. If you remember, the problem with if you go back, the problem with e6 was that this bishop is really bad. The Slob defense was basically developed to solve this issue for black. The main line proceeds as follows: knight c3, bishop f5, knight f3, e6. Black has achieved their goal of freeing up their light square bishop, but in doing so, they've weakened their b7 pawn. As white in this position, bishop f4 is a great move that cuts deep into your opponent's position and takes squares away from the black queen in the defense of the b7 square. It also prepares and supports. Prepares the support of e3. By getting our bishop out from under the pawn chain, we'll have to deal with a cramped bishop stuck on c1. After black plays a normal developmental move like knight f6, white can start the attack on b7 with queen b3, threatening capturing this b7 pawn. So how does black defend this? If black plays b6, white has bishop takes b7, bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, knight e5, threatening a fork with takes on knight takes c6. After queen takes c7, c takes d5, e takes d5, white has this really exciting e4. If black takes knight takes e4, we can play knight takes c6. It looks like the knight's hanging, but remember, if the queen takes here, we'll have bishop b5, and we'll win the queen with a pin to the king. So in this position, obviously black cannot take the knight. This is a fun, exciting position to play. It's difficult to relieve this pin. If black makes the mistake of doing something like this, then we can pick off the d pawn here, and black still cannot take here because of this pin coming. So b6 doesn't really work for us, for black at least, in terms of how to defend the b7 pawn. So if we go back, so we just showed how b6 is not really going to work for black. So what can black do? Black's most common response to this position is actually queen b6. Here, white should push c5. White should be content to trade queens, and he'll get a great queenside attack. After queen takes b3, a takes b3. Black has a pawn majority on the queen side. They've got a wide open a file, and basically what white's going to be doing is just pushing b4, pushing b5, and blowing open this pawn structure. They'll eventually also push e3, get their bishop involved, castle, bring the other rook over. And what black has to do is they've got to figure out how to get all their pieces that are kind of idling over on the king side of the board over to the queen side for the attack. So if you get into this line of the Slob defense, or the semi-Slav, you've done really well as white, and you can rest assured that you're coming out of the opening with kind of a great mid-game plan of expanding on the queen side. So that was the Slav defense, and now let's get into the final line of the Queen's Gambit that you really must know before you start playing this opening. And that starts with the same thing kind of we've been talking about, d4, d5, c4, and then the Alapin counter gambit. Black plays pawn e5. The reason why this is important to know is because one of the all-time greatest chess traps is in this little line of the Queen's Gambit, and it involves underpromoting to a knight on the 7th move. Yes, crazy stuff. But before I show you the trap, let me show you what white should do in this position if they were to play it correctly. White should capture d takes e5. And after d4, white should play knight f3. After knight c6, it's very important that white plays a3 to take away this b4 square from any checks. Then after bishop g4 from black, white can defend the knight with knight b to d2. After black exchanges the knights here, white can follow with eventual e3 to disrupt this pawn. The way this might proceed is this might knight come here, e3, takes, and black's knight will come out. As white, it's important to know that you don't have to hang on to this pawn. You remember this was a kind of a free pawn that you got at the beginning. It's going to be really difficult to hold on to this pretty far advanced, isolated e-pawn. So this pawn usually falls, but that's all right because white's going to get a fair bit of development. They're going to castle, and they're going to be safe. Now that I've shown you how white defends appropriately against the Alapin counter gambit, let me show you the trap, and you do not want to fall victim to this. So if we go back to the beginning, so here we are in our position. What black just played e5. So it kind of starts the same way that you normally would. So e takes d5, d4, and this is where the mistakes for white normally start. So if white makes the mistake of playing e3, a fairly normal looking move, after bishop b4, white blocks with the bishop. After d takes e3, this is when white really starts making mistakes. White gets greedy here, and they see that this bishop's hanging, and so what white is going to decide to do is do bishop takes b4. This is a huge mistake. You do not in this position. If you get to this position, you simply want to take back this pawn, but white makes this mistake, takes it anyway. Here, black has pawn takes f2 check. So what does white do in this position? If white captures this pawn, the queen hangs. So this king is the only thing protecting the white queen, and so the king has to stay next to it, basically. So you have to play king e2. And now it's black to move. And if you're ever black in this position, you may be tempted to move pawn g1 and promote to a queen. But this would be a mistake, because after queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, rook takes d8. The material's even, and white is actually a little bit ahead in development. So you don't want to do this as black. The best move for black in this position is actually pawn takes g1 with an under promotion to a knight with check. So now white loses a tempo having to respond to this threat. After rook takes g1, bishop g4 check, skewering the king and the queen here. And after king e1, queen takes d8, and white's king is on the run. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Touched on the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Queen's Gambit declined, the Slob defense, the Alapin counter gambit, and we discussed some important opening traps to be aware of for each of those. Now, if we go back to the beginning, I'd love to share with you my favorite line of the Queen's Gambit that I regularly use in games against players rated 2,000 plus. And that is the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. This is a very popular variation among grandmasters. And it starts with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight c6. And it's called the exchange variation because white exchanges their c pawn for the d pawn. Here, if black takes back with their knight, white just pushes e4, and they end up getting a huge pawn setter nice and early. So the most common move for black is not capturing back with the knight, but rather capturing with the pawn. After bishop g7, bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, c6, we kind of have the basic pawn setup that we're going to move into the middle game with. And this is a very high yield and important pawn structure to understand. This specific pawn structure, when black has 3 pawns on their king side and they have a pawn wall kind of coming opposite the white pawn wall, if you were to take all the pieces on the board and just look at the pawns, this is called the Carlsbad pawn structure. And it's a very well-known and like well-studied pawn structure. And from white's perspective, there's really 2 ways that white's going to end up breaking through this pawn structure. And that is with playing a move like f3 with eventual e4 and breaking through the center, or with a move like rook b1 and eventually b4, b5 and breaking through on the queen side. So the great thing I love about this opening, and the reason why I really enjoy playing this line, is because the development's pretty straightforward, and you get into middle games that can be very complex where both sides are trying to prevent white from breaking through the center or white from breaking through on the side with b4, b5. So here we are in this position. And I love it that already as white, I know exactly what my middle game plans are going to be. So after bishop d3, castle kingside, queen c2, h6, bishop b4. So I usually try and keep my dark square bishop on the board during these lines. I know earlier I mentioned that about exchanging, but for the exchange variation, I like to keep my dark square bishop really on the board. Knight b to d7. White leaves the option of f3 open by playing knight g to e2. After rook e8, castles, knight f8. We've got f3 with e4 coming, and this is just a great, I just love playing this line. And then, white also has the very important rook d1. So how would this proceed? So it might proceed something like this, and then rook d1 comes. And so now we're kind of, the white's gotten all their development done. You can see they're better developed even than black, right? Black's got this rook that's not really doing anything. This bishop's not really doing anything. And black's going to probably attack the center here with c5. But this is kind of the main line of the Queen's Gambit exchange variation. Very solid for white. And this is what I like to play. Well, I know this was a long video. Thanks for sticking it out with me to the end. Please like and subscribe and tell your friends if you found this helpful. As always, you can hit me up on MTX Chess Official on chess.com. I'll see you guys next week. Okay.